For today's video, we are going to be discussing Huntington's disease and the selection shadow. If you've taken any high school biology course, you are probably familiar with the concept of evolution and natural selection. Evolution is the process by which organisms change over time as a result of changes in heritable physical and/or behavioral traits. A good example of this is Darwin's finches and the evolution of beak sizes. From one species of the finch, several others have evolved over time. Depending on the environment that they inhabit, they have evolved adaptations that make them better suited for their specific ecological niche. Natural selection is a mechanism of evolution where organisms that are better suited to their environment tend to survive longer and produce more offspring, meaning those traits that make them better suited to their environment are passed on at a higher rate than others and are increasing in proportion in a population from one generation to the next. For natural selection to occur, there needs to be 1. Variation in the ability to survive and produce successful offspring, also known as fitness. 2. Variation in traits, also known as phenotype. 3. A relationship between phenotype and fitness, where one trait variant increases fitness and another trait decreases fitness, and vice versa. And 4. The differences among individuals needs to be heritable, so that they can pass the phenotype on to their offspring. One of the best examples of natural selection is the origin of whales. Using evolution as their guide, biologists knew that the transition of early whales from land to water occurred in a series of predictable steps. The evolution of the blowhole, for example, might have happened in the following way. Random genetic changes resulted in at least one whale having its nostril placed farther back on its head. The animals with this adaptation would have been better suited to a marine lifestyle since they would not have had to completely surface to breathe. Such animals would have been more successful and had more offspring, passing on this successful trait. In later generations, more genetic changes occurred, moving the nose further back on the head. Other body parts of early whales also changed in a similar way. For example, front legs became flippers, back legs disappeared, their bodies became more streamlined, and they developed tail flukes to better propel themselves through the water. Let's go through a checklist to make sure it meets all of the components of natural selection. These changes occurred because of random heritable genetic changes. These changes produce variation in phenotype. These changes produce variation in fitness. And the different phenotypes were associated with differences in fitness. As you can see, the evolution of whales meets the criteria for evolution by natural selection. The important point is that the origin of new genetic variants occurs at random in terms of its effect on the organism, but the probability of it being passed on to the next generation is not random if it impacts the survival and reproductive capabilities of that organism. So we know that natural selection is a non-random difference in reproductive output, often due to differences in the ability to survive in a particular environment, leading to an increase in the proportion of beneficial heritable characteristics within a population from one generation to the next. Therefore, you might expect characteristics that confer a survival and fitness disadvantage to decrease in proportion from one generation to the next and eventually disappear. However, if that were the case, then you might be wondering how many genetically inherited diseases that decrease survival and fitness are able to persist in the population if natural selection works. The key to understanding why many genetically inherited diseases are able to stick around is the age of onset. To explain this, I'm going to introduce you to the concept of a selection shadow and evolutionary theories of aging. The selection shadow was an idea proposed by Peter B. Medawar and J.B.S. Haldane in the late 1940s. They argued that most organisms die in the wild before they can experience the negative consequences of aging, and that the force of natural selection, a measure of how effectively selection acts on survival rate or reproductive output as a function of age, declines with progressive age. Due to the fact that the force of natural selection is weaker in late life and most organisms don't make it into late life, natural selection cannot favor beneficial traits or counteract deleterious traits when they are expressed only in late life. Any mutation, whether it is beneficial or harmful, that alters performance in late life will not have an effect on fitness and therefore is essentially invisible to selection. This concept is known as the selection shadow. On the x-axis, we have age, and on the y-axis, we have the force of natural selection. As you can see, the force of natural selection is highest between birth and age of maturity. Once age of maturity is reached, the force of natural selection declines quite rapidly. The shaded area of this graph is where selection cannot see deleterious mutations that affect the individual exclusively in late life. Therefore, selection will be inefficient at removing the mutation because it does not affect fitness and it will continue to be passed on to the next generation. The concept of the declining force of selection is key for many evolutionary theories of aging. These theories include the mutation accumulation hypothesis, antagonistic pleiotropy hypothesis, and the disposable soma hypothesis. The mutation accumulation hypothesis was proposed by Medawar and suggests that aging evolved because of the accumulation of mutations that negatively impact individuals during late life. The accumulation of these late-life deleterious mutations occurs because they are in the selection shadow, where selection is too weak to remove them. Therefore, they are able to accumulate in the population over time and cause aging. The antagonistic pleiotropy hypothesis was proposed by George C. Williams and suggests that if selection is too weak in later years to remove deleterious alleles or mutations, then the stronger selection during younger years could favor alleles or mutations that are beneficial during early life and increase fitness, even if they are harmful in late life and cause aging. The disposable soma hypothesis was proposed by Kirkwood and suggests that the evolution of repair mechanisms for aging was not needed in our evolutionary history because the risk of dying from external causes like predators was so high that organisms didn't live long enough to experience the negative symptoms of aging. This theory is like saying, who cares if we deteriorate, we are just gonna die anyway. To further illustrate the importance of the selection shadow in aging, I will present new research from James Nino et al. 2021. They found that when there is selection for late-life reproduction in ants, the selection shadow is reduced and aging actually never occurs. This was because the age of reproductive maturity essentially never ends. The ants continue to reproduce into late life, so traits that negatively affect their continued fitness can be seen by natural selection and acted on. Both the mutation accumulation hypothesis and the antagonistic pleiotropy hypothesis would predict that with strong selection that continues into late life, deleterious mutations that affect fitness and survival in late life would not accumulate, and this could cause the apparent absence of senescence in ants. So now that we know that the strength of natural selection rapidly declines after reproductive maturity, and in our evolutionary history, most organisms died before they could reach old age, it is easier to understand why inherited genetic diseases with late onsets are still around. We are going to explore this topic further with an example of an inherited human disease called Huntington's disease. As you may know, human offspring receive one copy of their genes from their father and one copy from their mother. The combination of these genes plays an important role in which traits and characteristics a person expresses. A dominant gene requires only one copy for it to be expressed, and a recessive gene requires both copies for it to be expressed. Huntington's disease is a progressive motor disorder caused by a mutation in a single gene on chromosome 4 that codes for the protein called Huntington. The mutation is dominant, meaning only one copy is needed for someone to have the disease, so half the children of affected parents will develop the disease. The abnormal Huntington protein causes brain changes that leads to motor and intellectual deterioration. Symptoms usually occur between the ages of 30 and 50 and include involuntary and jerky movements, severe dementia, irritability, and other mood changes. Death typically occurs 15 years after the first appearance of symptoms. In 1941, Haldane proposed that the declining strength of selection with age might explain the relatively high prevalence of the dominant allele causing Huntington's disease. He speculated that since Huntington's typically only affects people beyond age 30, such a disease would not have been efficiently eliminated by selection in ancestral pre-modern populations because most people would have already died well before they could experience this late-onset disease. Additionally, because the symptoms occur after reproductive maturity, the force of selection is much weaker as it does not negatively affect fitness. Thus, the disease falls into the selection shadow that we discussed and would not have been seen by or subject to natural selection. This explains why there is such a high prevalence of this devastating dominant allele. This phenomenon isn't limited to Huntington's disease. Other diseases like Alzheimer's disease, multiple sclerosis, and many types of cancers do not affect people until after they've reached reproductive maturity, putting them into the selection shadow, which has prevented them from being selected against throughout our evolutionary history and currently prevents natural selection from acting on them. Therefore, it's not that natural selection doesn't work, it's just much weaker because the age of onset of these diseases is after reproductive maturity, so they do not negatively impact fitness, and because pre-modern humans didn't live as long as modern humans, they did not experience the negative symptoms associated with these diseases. The phenotype-fitness correlation is one of the 4 key components of natural selection, but there can't be a correlation when the phenotype or symptoms of the disease occur after reproductive maturity and therefore has no effect on fitness. Therefore, natural selection cannot see the deleterious mutations that cause these diseases, and they will be passed on to the next generation. However, there are ways that an individual can take control of whether they pass on their deleterious mutations to the next generation. With advances in gene sequencing technology, scientists have been able to develop predictive test guidelines for several late-onset diseases, including Huntington's disease. Predictive testing is always optional, but it allows people to find out if they are likely to develop a disease later in life based on the mutations that they have in their genome. For example, someone who has a parent or parents with Huntington's disease may want to be tested for the mutation that causes the disease so they know what to expect later in life. This information can also influence a person's decision to have children or not. Because these diseases are often fatal and devastating, some people will decide that they do not want to risk passing that on to their children and will seek alternative options like adoption. This would not be possible without the advancements in gene sequencing technology that have brought the cost of genome sequencing down substantially and made the service much more accessible to the general population. Another recent advancement that could potentially allow us to remove deleterious mutations early on in embryo development and prevent genetic diseases from ever occurring is gene editing with CRISPR-Cas9, but that's a lesson for another video. I hope that you enjoyed this lesson and that you have a better understanding of why genetic diseases with a late onset have persisted in our species. See you next time!